This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Fiscally responsible, financial geniuses, monetary magicians. These are things people say about drivers who switch their car insurance to Progressive and save hundreds. Visit Progressive.com to see if you could save. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary, not available in all states or situations.
Holiday magic is in the air, and DSW's got all the shoes to make your season extra merry. Believe, you've got parties to attend and lists to check twice, so DSW is taking care of the details, like gifts to make their eyes all aglow. Styles that bring joy to your world. Brands everyone wants, like UGG, Nike, Birkenstock, and more. And deals to make your budget bright. Find the perfect shoes for you and yours at a DSW store near you or DSW.com.
Hello and welcome to episode number 251 of Real Life Ghost Stories. And to kick things off this week, I would like to say thanks to some of our newest Patreon subscribers. I would like to say thanks to Jennifer Taylor. Now, Jennifer, I'd written down your name wrong last week. I'd written down Jennifer Taylor instead of Taylor, so I apologise. Here is your actual proper shout out. So thank you, Jennifer Taylor. To Annette, Melissa Carn, Beth Whitaker, Destiny Reed, Shannon Moran, Jennifer Green Lachoni, Corey Thomas, Taylor Wynn, Jenna Lynn Miller, Nicole Herman, Shira Buis, and Bonnie Samaniego. Thank you so much to everybody for subscribing to the Patreon. I love you and appreciate you every single day. And our film review this week, our film review is Smile 2. Smile 2 was released in 2024. It has 7.2 out of 10 on IMDb and 85% on Rotten Tomatoes. About to embark on a new world tour, global pop sensation Sky Riley begins experiencing increasingly terrifying and inexplicable events. Overwhelmed by the escalating horrors and the pressures of fame, Sky is forced to face her dark past to regain control of her life before it spirals out of control. And as always with our film reviews, we're going to start with our likes. And you know what? I thought this was going to be pure and utter shite. I did not think it was going to be good. On the way to the cinema, I was saying to my friend, I don't know if this is going to be good. I feel like it's a cash grab because the first one did so well and they've gotten this one out so quickly. I just don't think it's going to be good. And guess what? I really liked it. I really enjoyed this film. So horror films, as a rule, do not give me nightmares, right? I've seen a horror film at least once a week for the last 6 years. And when you say it like that, that is wild. Even when I take time off, like when I do 31 Days of Terror, I will watch horror films still so that I can have like a back catalogue of film reviews to go through, you know. So I did watch Smile 2 a good few weeks ago now, but this one gave me nightmares. And I mean proper waking up in a sweat, heart-pounding nightmares. Like I had a nightmare about Smile 2, about the smiling people in Smile 2 that genuinely scared the living shit out of me. I woke up in a cold sweat, terrified, heart-pounding, had to get out of bed and turn on the light because I was so freaked. And bearing in mind, I sleep with a nightlight. But even the nightlight couldn't assuage my fears. I had to get up and turn on the big light. So this film obviously really settled right in there for me, you know? And fundamentally, this story follows the same story as the first Smile. If you haven't seen it, it is essentially some sort of demon entity. It, I guess, possesses people and causes them to take their own lives, and they do it in front of somebody. Henceforth, the demon, the entity, is passed on to the next person who has witnessed this death, right? That we are with the same story. It is 7 days, I think, after the end of the last story. And Naomi Scott is the girl who plays the lead role. And do you know what? I thought she was brilliant. I thought she was so good. And this felt like a gritty, ugly role, you know, and I felt like she really embraced it and she rolled with it and she was believable. And I did also think that obviously there was a whole, you know, demonic, paranormal, supernatural story going on, but I did think that it offered a brief but a good and clever look into the lives of these like mega pop stars and how corrosive fame can be. Now, granted, I don't think that was like delved into enough in this film, but I guess how many threads do you want for a horror film, you know, like, but I guess what that did do is that it allowed us to see Sky as flawed, that she wasn't this perfect pop star who was just, you know, on the receiving end of this awfulness. Like, she had done pretty grim things and her life had been complicated and she had complicated family dynamics, and you know, I thought it was interesting. And I really felt like after the first film, the first Smile, I didn't really know where this could go. I was like, where are the scares going to come from? Like, we've seen it. We know the premise. Creepy smiling people, we get it. We know, like, where the scare is going to come from. But let me tell you, there are scares galore in this film. I went to see this with Sinead from the Poisoner's Cabinet and another one of our friends. And I'm going to out Sinead on the podcast and say that she is the jumpiest person to watch a film with. And she would out me by saying that I am the person who I will grab her constantly grab her arm and be like, oh my God, do you think this is going to happen? What's going to happen? And the last time we went to see a film, which was actually Heretic, which I will be reviewing as well, she turned around and was like, can you stop? Because I just kept grabbing her, suggesting plot points, suggesting things that may happen, which is probably very annoying, I admit. But as we were watching it, there was a jump scare where Sinead literally jumped and screamed in the cinema. I thoroughly enjoyed it. And I am not a jump scares person, you know. Jump scares, A, I think they're lazy, and B, they don't impact me. But they worked in this film, and I jumped a lot watching this. And I watched a huge amount of this through my fingers because I was scared. I would like to draw your attention to the scene in her apartment that feels like a choreographed dance scene, because that was if you've seen it, that was the base of my nightmare, and it was terrifying. They did also attempt to answer some plot holes in the story of the first one, which I appreciated. I was like, okay, well done for recognising that there were plot holes, and well done for trying to cover those and be like, let's try and explore that. The soundscape as well is really scary. I would recommend staying until the end and listening to the rolling credits sounds, because they're really scary. And as for dislikes, to be honest, I don't have very many actual dislikes. Like, this film is not a masterpiece. It's not going to blow your mind. But it's fun. It's a fun, good watch. It's incredibly gory, which makes it difficult to watch at times. But I knew it was going to be gory going into it, so I'm not going to complain about the fact that it was gory. As with the previous Smile film, the monster is done with practical effects. And I just didn't like the monster. I thought it was stupid. It's not overshown, it's not overplayed, you don't see it the whole way through, nothing like that. I just thought it was stupid and I hated it and I didn't like the monster. There were ultimately as well plot points in the story which ended up being completely pointless and useless, which felt like a kind of a way to make the story more legitimate, but just didn't add anything, I think, in the long run. And it was 2 hours. It's over 2 hours long. It had no business being over 2 hours long. Cut it down. I sort of had gotten to this point, 2 hours in, where I was like, oh God, I'm so tired of seeing gore and death. Just get over it. Get on with it. Die or don't die. I don't care anymore. This is going on too long. It's taking forever. And there was one thing that I have to point it out, because it wrecked my head when I was watching the film. The character Sky and other characters throughout this film are constantly drinking Voss water, and as I understand it, Voss water is a sort of a posh water brand that comes in glass bottles. If I saw her drink one more bottle of Voss water, I was going to climb into the screen and smash that bottle of Voss water off somebody's head. I understand that advertising and product placement is an incredibly important part of how money is made in cinema and in TV shows, right? I understand that. But this was honestly, it just constant Voss water, just Voss water everywhere. They even made Skye drinking water a plot point so that she could be drinking Voss water all the time. At one point, I turned to Sinead in my very annoying way, probably grabbed her arm and said, "The fuck's with all the water? Do you think they're drugging the water? Is that why they keep showing water?" No. It was just shameless product placement, and it was aggressive product placement the whole way through, and it wrecked my head. But is this a good film? Yes, I thought it was. It's fun, silly, jumpy horror at its best. Watch it with friends. If it's still in the cinema, go and see it on the big screen. I really enjoyed it. I am going to give Smile 2 4 stars out of 5.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Fiscally responsible, financial geniuses, monetary magicians. These are things people say about drivers who switch their car insurance to Progressive and save hundreds. Visit Progressive.com to see if you could save. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary. Not available in all states or situations.
Holiday magic is in the air, and DSW's got all the shoes to make your season extra merry. Believe, you've got parties to attend and lists to check twice, so DSW is taking care of the details, like gifts to make their eyes all aglow, styles that bring joy to your world, brands everyone wants, like UGG, Nike, Birkenstock, and more, and deals to make your budget bright. Find the perfect shoes for you and yours at a DSW store near you or dsw.com.
Every idea starts with a problem. Warby Parker's was simple. Glasses are too expensive. So they set out to change that. By designing glasses in-house and selling directly to customers, they're able to offer prescription eyewear that's expertly crafted and unexpectedly affordable. Warby Parker glasses are made from premium materials like impact-resistant polycarbonate and custom acetate. And they start at just $95, including prescription lenses. Get glasses made from the good stuff. Stop by a Warby Parker store near you.
Thumbtack presents the ins and outs of caring for your home. Out. Uncertainty. Self-doubt. Stressing about not knowing where to start. In. Plans and guides that make it easy to get home projects done. Out. Word art. Sorry, live, laugh lovers. In. Knowing what to do, when to do it, and who to hire. Start caring for your home with confidence. Download Thumbtack today.
Which brings us to our story this week. Now, our story this week is one of those strange little stories that I came across randomly and then thought, how have I never heard of this before? I'm not going to give too much away. Let's dive straight into it. Nestled in the south of Italy is a village speckled with olive trees and sprawling with vineyards that sleep under the sound of distant, charming church bells. Along the country roads drive horses pulling wooden carts with produce on their way to market. But in 1901 there was something new on its way to the quaint village of Ruvo di Puglia. It was a young family filled with a warm happiness over what the future would hold. The patriarch and provider to this family on the move was Signor Mauro Pansini, an architect who had just purchased a local house with the profits from his work. With him was his beautiful wife and their 2 sons, 8-year-old Alredo and 7-year-old Paolo. Life at Ruvo di Puglia was a fresh start for the Pansinis, a new beginning. Not that they were in any particular need to start over, but the move to a new house that they could rebuild and remake into their own in a beautiful southern Italian village was a dream come true for the Pansinis, and they were eager to start off on this new journey. The family moved into their new home full of optimism and boundless energy and eagerly began renovations. But almost as soon as the work on the new family home began, so did something else, far more unsavoury and unsettling. Tools, materials, food, everyday common household items all began disappearing. Sometimes they would reappear in a different part of the house, which led Mauro and his family to believe that they had simply been misplaced during the chaos of the move and progressing renovations. But when things began disappearing never to be seen again, a dark and foreboding presence seemed to settle over the house. And it was in the midst of this growing sense of unease that the Pansinis would be given an explanation as to why things had suddenly started going missing all over their house. The family then witnessed objects, sometimes even big, heavy furniture, move seemingly on their own and with no explanation. This happening once or twice was quickly brushed off as a passing entity or a brush with the paranormal. But the objects around the house kept moving, and almost unbelievably the phenomena became so much worse. Instead of objects gently or even slowly moving from one place to another, they began to fly, almost like they were being yanked or violently pulled around. Pottery, glassware and earthenware, even food, would suddenly whip across the room and crash into walls, sending shrapnel flying in every direction. When the family were dealing with the chaos and the fear that these strange occurrences were creating, things then took another turn. Cutlery, chair legs and other furniture would twist and morph, almost like something with unbelievable strength had contorted them in an intense fit of rage. Now the heavy furniture wasn't moved an inch or two, but would be completely turned over, contents spilling all over the floor, and most of the time ending up completely ruined. The Pansinis were distraught. What was supposed to be their dream home come true had dissolved into a living nightmare in a matter of days, and they felt completely helpless to change it. Desperate to salvage what was left of their dream and their home, they attended a seance to see if they could reason with whatever paranormal entity was wreaking havoc on them. The seance, however, proved to only add fuel to the fire. Instead of appeasing the angry spirit or spirits who had taken to terrorizing the family, the seance seemed to enrage them. The violent and destructive outbursts continued, giving Mauro a theory as to what had targeted them. With what he had witnessed since moving into their new home, Mauro came to the conclusion that his family was not being tormented by normal spirits, or even poltergeists, but by demons. Demons were the only explanation Mauro could find that would fit the level of animosity that had been directed towards him and his family. And it was one of the only explanations he could find that would explain what was happening to his 7-year-old son, Alfredo. One day, while the family were all gathered together, something seemed to come over Alfredo. He slipped into a deep trance and began speaking. His voice became deep and low, monotonous in the way that he spoke his sentences, almost like he was dictating something to someone. Stranger than this sudden trance and change in Alfredo's demeanour was what he was actually saying. Alfredo was only 7 years old, and yet in this trance he began speaking in French, Latin and Greek. Some accounts even say that he began reciting long passages from the Divine Comedy word for word. These trances started happening more and more often, and every time Alfredo would wake up from them, he would have no memory of what had just happened, or what he had just said. But suddenly, from within one of those deep trances, Alfredo was able to deliver his family some good news. He told them that he had been sent by God to rid the house of the evil spirits that were haunting it, and he would replace them with good ones. Fear not, he told his family, for these new spirits would bring them everything the family could ever need. So the story goes, after Alfredo told his family that new and good spirits had arrived in the house, then new paranormal phenomena began occurring as well. Now, instead of food and household items suddenly disappearing, they began appearing, sometimes even in rooms that the family had just been in moments before. It seemed like these new spirits meant business, and were doing what they could to right the wrong that had been done to the Pansinis. But it would be Alfredo himself who would tell his family just how far these new spirits were willing to go. To corroborate Alfredo's story, there is an account printed in a local newspaper. The Giornale d'Italia reads, "One evening, the little Alfredo Paoli, aged 7 years, while the rest of the family were present, fell into a state of sleep and began to speak in a voice which was not his own, saying that he had been sent by God for the purpose of driving away the evil spirits. And it seemed for a while as if a better class of spirits had come. For now there were all kinds of sweets, candy and chocolate brought to them by the invisibles. And one night the little boy, while in a state of trance, described a battle taking place between the good and the bad ghosts. Next the boy began to walk mechanically and answer questions concerning things which he could not know. They took the boy to the church. There he became as insensible as a corpse, but woke up as the bishop called his name. He remained with the bishop for several days and then returned to his parents. That, according to young Alfredo, was that. The good spirits had done battle against the evil ones and had forced them out of the Pansini's new family home. Finally, it would seem, there could be order and peace at last. But the truth was that these good spirits weren't quite done with Alfredo just yet. The poltergeist activity around the house did stop after the trance in which Alfredo described the battle to his family, but the trances themselves continued. His parents, then fearing that their son was in danger from whatever it was that seemed to keep possessing him, sent him and his brother Paolo to live in a seminary school. With the boys out of the house, the phenomena stopped altogether. And at the school, with the boys surrounded by men of faith and living on sacred ground, the trances seemed to stop as well. For the most part, anyway. The priests and Alfredo's professors couldn't help but test him, and every test they threw at Alfredo he passed with flying colours. Just like he did when the Vatican itself sent Pope Leo XII's chief physician, Dr. Giuseppe Lapponi, to examine him. By the doctor's own account of Alfredo's time in the seminary, quote, "But even then some singular things happened. If anyone looked at him, intending to ask a question, so far only half formed mentally, he wrote the answer unconsciously. He was one day invited to attend a spiritistic séance, at which 3 of his professors were present. The boy went, but against his inclination. On the table was placed a paper triangle to mark the letters of the alphabet. The séance began, and this is the conversation that took place. 'Will you answer us?' 'Yes, but the triangle must be of wood.' 'We've not got one.' 'I've already made one, and you will find it in the kitchen in a stewing pan.' And a wooden triangle was really found in a saucepan. It was very accurately made. At the corners were nails which were neatly cut in half. 'Where did you make it?' He replied, 'At Barry,' and he indicated the road and the house, where there really is a carpenter's shop. Alfredo would continue to answer questions he shouldn't have known the answers to. Oftentimes, these answers would be written on a piece of paper that Alfredo would subconsciously seem to write on. He would often be recorded as shaking his head and verbally stating that he didn't know the answer to something, while simultaneously writing the answer on a piece of paper. This was mainly how the trances continued for the 3 years that Alfredo and his brother lived in the seminary, and when the trances got no worse, he was allowed to go home. Finally, in 1904, when Alfredo was then 10 years old, he and his brother Paolo were sent back to live with their parents. However, what must have been a happy and joyous reunion lasted for only a few short days, before the Pansini household quickly devolved into more, even stranger paranormal activity. The trances came back, not quite bigger and better, but like they had never gone away in the first place. But this time, there was a twist to them. Now, not only would Alfredo experience these mysterious trances, but his younger brother Paolo would as well. The Pansini parents now had 2 sons on their hands who could slip into a deep trance seemingly at any time and without warning. And then things took yet another turn. One day, when their mother had the local bishop over at their house discussing what she could do with the boys, something happened to them. The boys, who had been sitting and waiting in their room, weren't there when their mother went to fetch them. Their mother thought nothing of this at first, or in the worst case scenario, she thought that they must have been misbehaving and had slipped out of the house while she was talking with the bishop. The mother turned around, just about to tell the bishop that the boys must have run off, when there was a phone call. Another resident of Ruvo di Puglia had the boys on their property. The only problem was that this property was several miles away from the Pansini family home. The boys seemed distraught. But despite claiming that they had no idea how they had even gotten out of their room, let alone ending up several miles away from their house, their father didn't believe them. What he saw when he went to collect his sons were boys being boys, and he locked them back in their room as punishment for misbehaving. But the same thing happened yet again. And this time, the boys disappeared from behind a locked door. Famous contemporary Italian criminologist Cesare Lombroso actually investigated this second time that the boys went missing. Another time, he wrote in his report, in 10 minutes, they were at a distance from Ruvo and in front of the house door of an uncle of theirs, before whom Alfredo made the prediction that they would not be able to depart the next day, not until 15 days had elapsed. In fact, the next day the uncle's horse was taken ill. Then the aunt hired a carriage to take back her nephews to Ruvo, but no sooner had they been recognised to their parents than they disappeared again, and again found themselves at Trani. Being sent back to Ruvo, they disappeared once more and found themselves at Bisceglie. Then, convinced that they were struggling in vain against superior powers, they betook themselves to Trani to await the expiration of the 15 days. This was only the beginning of the Pansini brothers' experiences with disappearing and reappearing again almost instantaneously in locations a great distance away. In other words, teleportation. One account in the Giornale d'Italia has them disappearing from a moving carriage only for them to be found waiting at their intended destination. One day, the article reads, the lad Alfredo with his brother Paolo, aged 8 years, were at Ruvo at 9 a.m. And at 9:30, they were found at Capuchin Convent at Malfatti, some 30 miles away. Another day, the whole family were sitting at the breakfast table at 12:30 p.m, and as there was no wine, the little Paolo was sent for it. He did not return. And half an hour afterwards, Alfredo suddenly disappeared, and at 1 p.m, both boys were found in a fishing boat on the sea not far from the port of Barletta. They began to cry, and the fisherman, being himself frightened almost out of his wits by their sudden appearance, took them ashore, where by good fortune they found a coachman who knew them and took them home, where after a rapid drive of half an hour they arrived at 3:30. In this way they were spirited away on other occasions to Bisceglie, Giovinazzi, Mariotti and Ferlizzi, and brought back to their parents in the ordinary way. The boys were usually found in a deep trance whenever they went missing. They couldn't remember what had happened to them or how they had suddenly travelled so far in such a short amount of time. It's perhaps no surprise that the Vatican took another vested interest in the boys and what was happening to them. They sent the same physician, Dr. Giuseppe Laponi, to investigate the brothers and see if they could get to the bottom of how they seemed to disappear and reappear without a trace. Laponi reportedly locked the boys in a room after sealing off all the possible exits and entrances. And even then, Alfredo and Paolo disappeared only to show up again several miles away from the house. News of the Pansini brothers spread like wildfire all across Italy, and everyone had their own theory to explain how the boys were teleporting across the region. Witches, the devil, portals to hell, and the extraordinary powers of the mind were all used to explain how the boys were doing it. But it was Alfredo himself who would provide the answer. Well, perhaps more accurately speaking, it was the spirit inside him who told his parents what was happening to their children. The spirit claimed that it was them who were dematerializing the brothers in one place only to rematerialize them in another, just like they had been doing with all of the food and chocolates that they had made disappear and appear in the household before. Skeptics would argue another theory. Ambulatory automatism is the phenomenon when a person enters something similar to a trance and is overcome with the insatiable urge to move. It is very similar to sleepwalking and would explain why the children had no memory of how they had come to be in the places where they would resurface, although it wouldn't explain how they managed to move great distances in a matter of minutes. It also wouldn't explain how no one else would have seen the boys walking, as they would have had to travel along main routes and busy streets between villages, and would have surely been noticed by other passers-by, especially if they were walking in a trance-like state. One report in the Annals of Psychical Science would say of it, with regard to the mysterious disappearance of the two brothers Pansini and their almost instantaneous appearance in another locality, the hypothesis most easily accepted by the Italian savants who have looked into the matter is that it is a case of ambulatory automatism. It is known that subjects affected with this nervous disease feel an irresistible impulse to move about and then fall into the second state. When they return to their normal state, they have forgotten all about it. Dr. Petrus, writing in the Secolo of Milan, does not exclude the hypothesis that the two boys in a state of muscular hyperesthesia might traverse, walk, or even run distances of 30, 40, 50, even up to 90 kilometers without resting. Nevertheless, he asks how they could possibly walk or run 14 kilometers, 9 miles, in half an hour. Besides, he adds, how is it that these two lads in their precipitate peregrinations have never attracted the attention of passers-by, when the main roads of these districts are always frequented by numerous carts and persons on foot? Another, more worldly explanation could be that the children had been influenced into believing that they were being haunted and possessed by paranormal entities. The Pansinis, like many Italian families, were highly religious, but they were also highly interested in the occult. Mauro and his wife would often attend seances, meaning that the concept of spirits and poltergeists was very much included in their day-to-day lives. But there was a bit more to this part of the story. Not only did Mauro and his wife frequently attend seances, but they would also take the boys as well. Was it possible that the Pansini brothers had discovered a way of acting out against their parents through one of these seances? Was this their way of letting their parents know that they weren't actually all that thrilled about moving away to the countryside and leaving their old life behind? Maybe they were looking for a way to convince their parents to take them back to the life they had led before. Or maybe spirits really had been talking through Alfredo, and maybe the boys were simply being carted here and there by supernatural forces because that was where they were supposed to be in that particular moment in time. Just like the spirit inside Alfredo had told their uncle right at the beginning of their teleportation experiences. The boys continued to live this difficult and terrifying life until they entered puberty. And then, it seems, whatever had firmly gripped them in its grasp finally let them go. You know, sometimes when I'm doing this podcast, right, I've been doing this for 6 years. I don't know how many times I need to mention the fact that I've been doing this for 6 years in this episode, but here we are. I've been doing this for 6 years, and I often think, oh, fuck, like, is this, am I going to run out of stories? Have I gotten to the end of paranormal stories? There are no more possible paranormal stories. And then you come across little gems like this and you think, we are okay. All is right in the paranormal world. It's a really strange, short little story. There is not that much information about it that I could find online. I believe Dr. Giuseppe Laponi, who was the Vatican physician, I believe that he wrote about the boys in one of his books back in the early 1900s. And it's a fascinating story, and it's got multiple layers, right? Because on the surface of it, you think this is a family who are clearly incredibly religious and they are into seances, etc. And they're bringing these small, impressionable kids to these seances, right? And when little Alfredo, right, starts speaking in different languages, they say that he starts speaking in French, Latin and Greek. And some accounts say that he starts reciting long passages from the Divine Comedy, word for word. And I kind of have a couple of thoughts about that, right? First of all, if this kid is being taken to seances and has been taken to numerous seances before, I can guarantee you he has seen people in trances. He has seen people slip into trances and start speaking in other languages. Who is to say that he has not picked up little bits and pieces of French, Latin and Greek from seeing these other seances? Also, the Divine Comedy is one of the most important works, poetic works in Italian literature, right? So it would have been well known. And if these kids had gone to school, which I presume they did go to school, their father was an architect or a builder, so they would have probably had the means to go to school. One can only imagine that these kids would have probably learned sections of the Divine Comedy in school. So I'm just fundamentally not convinced that Alfredo was slipping into these trances and speaking in other languages and, you know, reciting the Divine Comedy. Also, I think it's really important to note, right, and this is my degree in Catholic theology coming into play here, that Mass was said in Latin. Catholic Mass was said in Latin until after the 1960s. So there was a sort of a big old meeting called the Second Vatican Council, and they decided that if they really wanted to communicate the word of God to people in Catholicism, they needed to stop saying Mass in Latin and start saying it in the language of the place where the Mass was being held. So if these children were going to Mass, if Alfredo and Paolo were going to Mass, they would have heard lots of Latin and lots of religious Latin. It was also only after Vatican II, so the Second Vatican Council, that priests turned to face their congregation. Prior to that, they said Mass with their back to the congregation and in Latin, which is very inaccessible, I would argue. So, you know, Vatican II, good thinking. It's not therefore beyond the realms of possibility to think that Alfredo and Paolo would have listened and retained the shapes of the words in Latin, even if they didn't understand the things that they were saying themselves. I also think it's interesting that these spirits were apparating chocolate and sweets around the house, because if I was a 10 and an 8-year-old boy or whatever age these boys were, I'd be absolutely delighted if chocolate and sweets were materializing everywhere. That would make me pretty happy. But I'd imagine for mom and dad, they might be thinking, Jesus, we could really do with some out of season veg or some fresh meat, some fresh fish. Like, that'd be great. And I know that obviously it sounds like I'm being super cynical, and in a way I am, but I do think that in these sort of situations where there's weird shit happening around the house, I think that regardless of whether this stuff is paranormal or not, the children in the house end up feeling this immense pressure to perform. And in my opinion, these children performed in the way that they had learned to do. Alfredo, being older, probably would have taken in a lot more at these seances and probably would have seen people slip into trances and say these things. And then Paolo learned from Alfredo's behaviour. I would be interested to know what the relationship was like between the parents themselves and how the parents treated those children in the household prior to them moving. Were the children upset about moving? You know, that would be interesting to know. Because I do think that regardless of paranormal explanations, I think that poltergeist cases have a psychological root. And this story to me really reminds me of the Eleanor Zugan story that I did relatively recently, a few main episodes ago, where there was just so much religious fear in that household. You know, she picked up a coin and they were like, well, the fucking devil's going to get you because you used that coin to get sweets and you are going to be absolutely harassed by the devil from now on. And then all this weird shit starts happening. It really does seem like these kids were living in a household where there was a huge religious emphasis and a huge emphasis on, you know, spirituality and seances and the paranormal. And dad's immediately going, it's demons. It's definitely demons. It's not just a poltergeist. It's not just normal spirits. This isn't normal. This is demonic. And is that enough to whip up such fear within children that these things escalate and the poltergeist activity gets worse? Because I do think both things can be true at the same time. I think poltergeist activity can happen. And I also think that kids can fake things and maybe not even realize that they're faking it. You know, maybe they are so wrapped up in this whole story that they begin to engage in this in a way that they don't even realize they're engaging with it. You know, like almost subconsciously they're slipping into trances. Things are happening, things are appearing and disappearing. And I do think probably the kids in the household had something to do with some of the phenomena that they were experiencing. And it doesn't explain the meat of this story, which is how the heck these boys were apparently disappearing from rooms and then appearing like miles and miles and miles away, seemingly without any other human being seeing them making their way to that location. So if you want to be like super skeptical about this, you would say that either somebody with a horse and cart was collecting these children and bringing them to these other locations as quickly as possible, and then everybody was going, oh yeah, they were in a trance, and the kids were like, oh yeah, we were in a trance, but actually they were just being transported. Or the timings are not accurate. So mum is saying, well, I checked at 9 o'clock and they were there in their bedroom, and then by 9:30 they were, 10 miles away. Is it possible that maybe they hadn't been checked on since the night before and the boys actually left a lot earlier and had made their way to wherever it is that they had gotten to all those miles away? And that's all well and good until you get to the story of the fisherman, where it's like the kids appeared in this boat out to sea. Oh my God, if I was that fisherman and you're sitting there fishing away and just minding your own business, trying to get on with your day job, and these two little boys appear in the boat behind you and they're like, hi, yeah, sorry, we don't actually know how we got here. I would flip them off the boat with the oar. You know what I mean? I honestly would use the oar as a lever. I'd put the oar under the children. I would jump on the other end and launch them into the horizon, because I'd be like, no, I'm not having this, you little freaks appearing on my boat. I didn't ask for this. I'm just here trying to do a day's work. Unless, of course, that story didn't actually happen and it has become part of the mythology around this story, because it really adds a bit of meat and weight to it to go, and they appeared in a boat in the middle of the sea, because there really is no way to explain that. And there is also the question of who is reporting all of these incidents. Like, are these incidents being reported by the parents to journalists? Are these incidents being reported by the parents to the bishops, to the Vatican investigator? Are people actually witnessing these things happening in the space of time that they are said to be happening? Or are we hearing about these incidents after the fact? Because I will say that as an Irish person, time and storytelling is very flexible. To give you an example, I could say the other day, when I'm telling a story, I could be like, oh, the other day me and Sinead went to the cinema to see Smile 2. And in this instance, the other day could mean anything from yesterday to 6 months ago. So is it possible that time is being slightly distorted in this situation? But then that still doesn't explain how nobody is seeing these children travelling 10 miles. This story is complicated, and my gut instinct is telling me that there is possibly some exaggeration going on or some flexibility with timelines. But I do genuinely think the similarities between this and the story of Eleanor Zugan are really interesting. I also think it's really interesting that apparently this all stopped when they became teenagers, when they entered puberty. It was just like, well, we're done with this now. How many stories have we seen where this activity seems to have been linked to hormonal cycles in young people? And I do often think with stories like this, right, that two things are equally as fascinating. Number one, was this poltergeists in this house? They started renovating, they disturbed something. The kids were actually teleporting here, there and everywhere. The kids were actually going into trances. You know, say all that is true objectively and it was paranormal and we can prove that it's paranormal. That's fascinating. Equally as fascinating is the psychology behind what causes a person to either believe this and think that this is 100% happening, even if the children are making it up or even if people are being hoodwinked somehow. But what is also equally as fascinating is if a group of people are making this up, are actively trying to convince people that these children are teleporting. Why? For what reason? They didn't get anything out of it, only attention. And in my opinion, the psychology behind that is just as interesting. As an aside, before we finish up this episode, I recently finished watching the Manhattan abduction story. It's on Netflix, and I realised that it is the reason why I'm so afraid of aliens. And I will probably do a main episode about that story at some point, but it is a really, really interesting look into, you know, these sort of stories. Obviously, it's an abduction story, so it's different. These sort of fringe stories and the psychology behind people potentially faking them and whether or not people are faking these stories and why. And it's very interesting. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode of Real Life Ghost Stories. If you would like to send in your story, you can do so by emailing it to reallifeghoststoriespodcast@gmail.com. You can also check out the website, that is reallifeghoststoriespodcast.com. And if you are desperate for some extra content, you can subscribe to the Patreon. That is patreon.com/reallifeghoststories, where for $5 a month or $2 a month, you get access to heaps of extra content, as well as every single main and mini episode completely ad-free. And on that note, I shall see you next time.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Fiscally responsible, financial geniuses, monetary magicians. These are things people say about drivers who switch their car insurance to Progressive and save hundreds. Visit Progressive.com to see if you could save. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary, not available in all states or situations.